Hello, friends. Thank you for joining me. My name is Nnamdi Nnake, and I host Nationhood Podcast. Today, I am excited to present the first edition of Conversations, where we will bring historical perspectives to current issues. Our guest is Jediael Peterson, a historian and doctoral researcher at Stony Brook University. Ms. Peterson's work examines Nigeria's nation-building project in the 20th century, and she does this by exploring the roles of different ethnic groups. Amongst other things, Jediael is interested in the protest movements that resulted from the nation-building project, and with a specific focus on the South-South and Southeast regions. In today's episode, we will be discussing oil exploration in Ogoniland and bringing historical perspectives to this activity from political, economic, and sociocultural perspectives. And so, without further ado, I am honored to welcome Jediael Peterson to Nationhood Podcast. You're welcome, Jediael.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have today.
Amazing. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation to grace the podcast. I'm excited to hear you share your insights from the research you've done, and I believe that listeners would also be enlightened. The first time I heard you speak was at a conference, which was 2 weeks ago in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where you unraveled several connections between oil, spectacle, and the dynamics of the Nigerian state. And I'm going to come to that in a moment, but I'd like us to start small. So first, can you tell us about your experience as a researcher who's been researching Nigeria's nation-building project and why you've chosen this area of study as a historian? Like, why is it so fascinating?
Yes, of course. So, my research or my interest in researching Nigeria started my junior year of undergrad. So I went to Temple University and I applied for this scholarship called it's the Diamond Scholars Program, where from June up until December, it was a cohort of I believe 6 to 9 students in different fields. And we were given resources to do different research. And so at first I've always been interested in Blackness and race and nationhood. And so I wanted to look at the trans-Saharan slave trade at first. But the way I came about history is very much talking to my grandfather and my mother about their lived experiences. And whenever they would tell stories, it was always so fascinating to me that they lived through those periods. So my mom would tell me that she remembers a coup occurring and she would run out of school barefoot into the streets with her friends. And she wasn't focused on the fact that a coup happened. She was focused on the fact that she had to skip school. She was happy about skipping school. My grandfather fought in the Nigerian Civil War, so he has a bullet in the back of his neck or upper back that he always talks about whenever we would complain. So if I want to complain about waking up in the morning, he's like, at least you don't have a bullet, and like, so little things like this where it was so casual to them. But for me, this was very eye-opening in a discussion of Nigerian history. And so I moved away from looking at the trans-Saharan slave trade into Nigerian history. And my first project was very inspired by my grandfather. So I wrote about the relationship that Niger Delta minorities had to Biafra and how later on Biafra became a space of inheritance for minorities like the Ijaw who wanted to secede from the nation or also challenge the Nigerian state, and how I wrote this project during the End SARS protests too. And so around October, the research moved in a very drastic position where young Nigerians have inherited this struggle of constantly challenging the state. And a lot of people paid attention to End SARS when the protests came to Lagos and Abuja, but a lot of the tactics of police brutality had already been alive in the Niger Delta. So I was noticing this pattern of Nigerians in the States ignoring the repression of people in the Niger Delta and only amplifying it when those same tactics were used in the cities. And so I was very curious as to why this is. How can someone say that they're a citizen of a nation, but still be ignored and subjected to extreme levels of violence by the state. And so that kind of became the genesis of my interest in Nigerian history, where I was curious as to what it really means to belong to a state as an ethnic minority. So I wrote the project. It was a very challenging paper to write, especially as there were a lot of high levels of emotions as a result of the NSARS protest. And I was very lucky to get to interview people who their fathers participated in the war. They were children when the war happened. They had siblings. And then I also interviewed people who were protesting against SARS. So a very emotional project, but I think it really touched at what I love about history, where it's a communal project. I could not have written that history without people volunteering their stories to me. And I really think that project is what really made me want to be a historian and a researcher. Um, and yeah, that's really what really began my interest in Nigerian history and just really excavating the truth, because the stories are out there, we just aren't hearing about them.
That's amazing, and I can completely relate to the personal um, experience that has influenced the choice. When I speak to a lot of historians, there is always the tendency to find that there is a personal angle to why people have chosen certain fields. And I think it's a good thing because in addition to bringing your own professional experience and interests, there is also the personal touch that comes with that, in terms of your insights and how they influence that. So, for example, if you're talking about the Biafran War, which your grandfather was a part of, you have those personal stories to help enrich the research you are doing and, all the material you're able to access as a historian. That adds a lot of flavor to your to your history. That is really cool. So let's move a little bit closer to what you're currently researching now, oil exploration, Ogoniland. You discussed at the last the conference I was talking about earlier where we met about spectacle and its connections with oil exploration. Can you just shed some light on what you meant by spectacle? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I'm very interested in protest movements, so the different kinds of protest movements that ethnic minorities in the Niger Delta have taken up against the state. I feel like we hear a lot about the Niger Delta militants and militancy just in regards to oil, but I was interested in the history, like what is the foundation of these protests? Why was there a move towards violence? And so my use of spectacle comes from Guy Debord. He's a French situationist philosopher, and he writes about spectacle more so through film and photography as a way of swaying the opinions of people. So at first I didn't really think it could apply to the Ogoni, but in a eulogy written by The Guardian, they discussed how Ken Saro-Wiwa bought a bunch of camera equipment and began filming the environmental degradation that was occurring on Ogoniland. And I think it was very important to underscore that the environmental crisis that was going on in Ogoni was not a priority to a lot of people outside of Ogoniland, as they were also dealing with Babangida and then Sani Abacha. So it was very much we need to get rid of military rule in Nigeria, and there wasn't a focus on environmental degradation. And Ogoniland is very isolated. I think this is also a result of the mangroves, but they're a very isolated community and they only really interact with each other. Even an example of this is the fact that they were fairly unscathed by the slave trade. A lot of their members of Ogoni were not, sold into slavery. So that's how isolated they are. So this issue was not something that people were concerned with or thought that they had to lend primacy to. So when Ken Saro-Wiwa starts filming what's going on in a lot of people's backyards, what's happening in a state that belongs to Nigeria, there's this shock that kind of goes through the state, but also the international world as to the level of degradation that the Ogoni are facing. And so it's through this mode of showcasing through film and photography the environmental degradation that I landed on spectacle. And spectacle, the foundation of spectacle essentially is display. You are displaying your grievances for people to consume. And so it involves two parties, yourself as the person who is being subjugated and the participants who are also watching. And so there can be different responses to spectacle, whether disgust, ignorance, a complete rejection, but spectacle is still at play here. And the Nigerian state also uses spectacle, but more so to showcase its power, where they're displaying their power as a state. So Nigeria hadn't been independent for that long. At that point, it's only been about 30 years. So the foundations of Nigeria as a state is very weak. And so spectacle also helps the Nigerian state showcase that our foundations are strong, which we know it's not because of the civil war occurring shortly after independence. But I think spectacle is just one of the ways in which we can look at the Ogoni trying to amplify their voices past the national stage into the international stage, because they know that they're not protected by the government, they're not protected by the state. And so you see this with also a lot of independent and protest movements across Africa, where they start looking to the United Nations and looking to international entities to come and help them, because they realize that the state is not going to help them at all. And I think that's why I really wanted to focus on spectacle, because there's this display happening, there's this begging for recognition to be seen is at the core of it. And I think that that's really at the core of the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, Mossop. I think that's at the core of their movement, is this need to be seen as humans, so that the environmental degradation and state repression that they're facing is not normalized. Because once you normalize it, it moves on to a different level where people in different cities are now facing that same repression, and they're shocked as to how could this happen to us, but there's precedent for it. And so I think that pulling from the situationist movement, where I actually had this one question, someone asked me if Ken Saro-Wiwa read Du Bois' work, and I was like, no, he did not, but I do think that theories exist in place for us to play with it and place it in different areas. And I think spectacle works really well with the Ogoni, at least in the 90s, for the specific kinds of protests that they were doing. So yeah, that's really why I wanted to look at spectacle. It was also a challenge to myself to see if I could do it. And I like to think I was a bit successful in doing it. So yeah.
Yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. And listening to you speak, some images were flashing through my mind, with respect to spectacle. I was reminded of the civil rights movement in the United States, with people like Martin Luther King and the American government relying on display to appeal to the people, So these civil rights campaigners were able to use the beatings they received on camera to appeal to people, say, look at the way we are being treated by the government and stuff like that. So I found that really interesting, your description of spectacle. So speaking about Nigeria and Ken Saro-Wiwa, Mossop, using like media technology to drive this narrative of their protests, are there any parallels you think that we can draw from his protest movements to protest movements of today, like NSAS, which you just mentioned, especially within the context of nation building and other factors like international influence and how these external players affect what is going on locally?
Yeah, I 100% absolutely think that there's so many parallels being drawn today, because even when you think about who controls the narrative of our discussions on oil degradation and oil politics, it's unfortunate to think, but I think that we haven't seen a large protest movement in the Niger Delta region to the level of Mossop that really utilized images and this plea to see the human self. Because now when you see the images, you usually see militants with guns on boats, they've kidnapped people, but we're not hearing it from the perspective of the people who are carrying the guns and who are kidnapping. What pushed you to do that? What are the conditions that you're living in that makes you take up arms to defend yourself? We're not hearing that perspective. I think the Nigerian government has successfully sort of branded them as against the state, and they've almost become like a nuisance now, that even people living in those regions become irritated by them. So I think that that's why Ken Saro-Wiwa's mode of protest and Mosso's mode of protest was very important. But also in the international world, when you think about in Ireland in the IRA, a lot of what they used were images and newspapers to get to people to understand the level of British suppression on their land. They used speeches. The radio was extremely important in broadcasting their own narratives of what's occurring. Literature, I think that that's one thing that excuse me, Africans have in common is the use of literature to narrate their own stories. Because if you don't write or talk about the subjugation that you're experiencing, the people that are like subjugating you will say that you enjoyed it. So it's one of those things where there's a long tradition of broadcasting your grievances. The modes have just changed. It's the same thing like you brought up the American Civil Rights Movement. I absolutely believe that pictures of police officers using water hoses down on peaceful protesters, that does something to the American psyche where you see citizens, you see your fellow citizens going through that. Um, and you're appalled by the level of violence that the state can use. I think that we're seeing that with Israel and Palestine right now, where the images coming out of Palestine are mobilizing people to call for a ceasefire because this level of violence that they're experiencing, you look at the human and you see that this can be you. And I think that's why the visual aspect of protest is extremely important. But also End SARS, I think. I think End SARS, they didn't showcase dead bodies, not to my knowledge, but just the image of young Nigerians taking the street, because in Nigeria's 21st century history, I don't think we've had such a large level of protest by youth in big cities. So just those images of young people taking the streets and protesting against the state, given who was president at the time, Buhari, and his history of military rule and suppression, was an extremely brave act, and it moved people around the globe. And so you had international bodies, you had celebrities, you had people across the diaspora calling for something to be done. So there is precedent for this. And I do truly believe that it began late 80s and the 90s with this use, at least in Africa, with this use of the visual to gain attention and like not discredit yourself in the international stage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that is a very good point. So I'm curious about something you mentioned, which are defined like as a complexity that arises in protest movements. You spoke about how there are instances where the people of Ogoniland, for instance, were unhappy with the turn that the protest movement took, maybe the violence, and that is why people like Saro-Wiwa's use of the media was, well received, if I can put it that way. So just can we speak a bit more about the complexities, that you found in your research, where maybe the protest movement is at cross purposes with itself, or where it seems like some people who are protesting, in quotes, are actually working for the government against the people, so to speak. What have you found in the course of your research?
Yeah, it's a very complicated matter because I think one of the things I really had to realize while doing this research is these are people. It's one thing to write about the history of violence and environmental degradation that they're facing, and it's another thing to live through it. It's a very normal human reaction, I think, to that if you're experiencing more violence as a result of a protest occurring, that you would get frustrated. And I think that, especially as historians working in the West, it's easy to remove ourselves from these frustrations because I'm not the one whose, daughter was killed by the police as a result of an uprising that occurred or as a result of a walkout or boycott. That did not happen to me. And so it's really realizing that the people who are experiencing this have different opinions. It's the same thing with the civil rights movement. A lot of people were not fans of MLK. They did not like what he was doing. A lot of people were not fans of Malcolm X. But now later on, it's easy to valorize them as they're dead, and forget the histories of the people who had to pay a price for this revolution, for this movement. On the other hand, you have sort of the elites who, and one thing in my research I realized is that a lot of elite Ogoni and elite people of different minorities realize that there is power in numbers. So if you have a large unified ethnic group, you are able to gain more favor with the Nigerian government. You're able to appeal to the state for a lot of transportation, for hospitals, for school buildings, but also for monetary gain, for personal gain too. You're allowed to, you can sit in government, you can enrich yourself. And a lot of elite Ogoni people realize this too. It's the same reason why you have secessionist movements popping around. And if you look at the leaders, they're usually people who come from like elite backgrounds. I think we rarely see leaders of secessionist movements kind of come from, a poor background, no education. You rarely see that happen. Um, but so on one spectrum, you have the people whose lives are being affected by this revolution, by this movement. On the other hand, you have people who are gaining, um, they're gaining things from this movement. And so a lot of times there was this push also to mobilize the Ogoni as one united ethnic group, regardless of the fact that environmental degradation was happening. If the Ogoni weren't if they weren't dealing with oil spilling, it would have happened a different way where the elite would push for a united view because one of the fascinating things I found in my research was that different subgroups of the Ogoni did not consider themselves Ogoni up until like the 1930s, 1960s, and like finally the 90s. An example of this is the LM group. I hope I pronounced that right, but the LM group, they up until 1930 were not in the census were not considered Ogoni, but now they are because they're united through this shared struggle of oil politics, and so there's a political advantage to uniting that the elites utilize, but then also you have the third group that conspires against these groups because there's monetary gain to be had. If you go against, your ethnic group as it's becoming a unified one, the Nigerian government favors you, you're going to, you're going to see yourself in positions of power. And I think it really speaks to how complicated human beings are and how messy history can be. There's no one good ethnic group that has been completely villainized and they've taken the right path the whole time. There are people within those ethnic groups who conspire against them. There are people within those ethnic groups who don't see an issue with the fact that their land is being, destroyed because they don't even live there. They've moved to the cities. They're living in a mansion in Abuja, they have government positions. And so I think one of the things that I really had to keep reminding myself is when writing this history is not to make it so black and white where it's the Ogonis versus the state. That's why I think it was easy to focus on Ken Saro-Wiwa and focus on the Mossop movements because they had a clear vision. And even the reason that Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed was the fake charge that he was part of the assassination of four pro-government chiefs, Ogoni chiefs. And so there's always going to be interfighting within different groups, especially when things like self-determination, secession, creating a unified group comes to play. And this really goes back to Nigeria's history where ethnicity is not a rigid thing. It's very fluid. And it's only now that it's becoming rigid as a result of colonialism and state repression. And so people are going to act that way in a way that ethnicity is not fluid if they can get personal gain from it. And so it was really having to contend with that while writing this history.
I can appreciate that challenge that historians face, and I think this is one of the benefits of a conversation like this. Public history for people who are not professional historians, and that is not a diss to anybody. And I'm just saying people who don't practice history for a living more usually tend to assume a black and white, position. It is the job of the historian to be able to point out the kind of complexities you've just identified right now. So usually there will be multiple interests in the group, like you mentioned, amongst the Ogoni, or even as in the case of Ken Saro-Wiwa, there was the accusation that he had, driven or engineered the death of those four chiefs who were also Ogoni people and who also had interest in the betterment of Ogoniland, even if their own perspective may have been different from his, and then the government says you did this and all that stuff. So we are able to bring out all these complexities. And I like how you point out that there were or that there are clashes between individual interests and then the interest of the small group like the Ogoni as a minority or as an ethnic group. If we're thinking about any other, maybe it's Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo, whoever. So there's the difference or differences between the individual interest, the group interest, and national interest. So all of these different interests are kind of like vying, for prominence, and ultimately, in one way or the other, they are casualties. Not necessarily people who die, but some interests have to be suppressed for some others to prevail, right? So I
Yeah.
want to go back a little further because you mentioned a group earlier, like a subgroup of the Ogoni DLM. How do you spell that? I want to put that in the description so people can tell.
Yeah, it's Eleme.
Okay, the Eleme people. Eleme.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Eleme, that's fine.
Like,
I have a friend who's from Eleme, and it's a place I've been to. In fact, I've spent some time there. Interesting. Okay, that is nice. I wanted to just so that people can follow the conversation.
yeah.
Okay,
No, and
so
also thanks for checking in because I was like, I feel like I know I got that pronunciation right. Because that's one of the things when you're reading, you're like, huh, how do you
that's
pronounce
okay.
this?
That's okay. That's okay. I'm familiar with the location. And yeah, I'm glad we had that conversation because the idea is also to make sure people can follow the conversation. And when you take them back to the 1930s, like you were just doing, you want to be able to make sure people can also follow the conversation. So following that general, direction of looking back,
Hmm.
have there been any other protest movements, outside of the ones led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, which you think are, maybe less popular, but no less impactful, that you think would interest people to know about that you found while doing your research?
In Nigeria or just
For
across?
in Ogoniland, specifically in relation to oil exploration in Ogoniland. The reason I ask is because I mean, the damage that oil exploration has caused to the environment in Ogoniland and the Niger Delta generally is not news. So
Yeah.
everybody knows about that. And you've spoken, in one way or the other about Ken Saro-Wiwa, Mosop, and even his execution with the others who are now popularly called the Ogoni Nine. So but looking beyond that particular protest movement, which is very popular, and every November 10th, I believe, people,
Yes.
you'll see articles in the papers, you see commemorations and what have you. So but just
Hmm.
beyond that, are there any other protest movements, that may be of interest to people,
Yeah.
if they are not as
Actually,
popular?
I'm really excited to talk about this because I just started reading Naked Agency. I had to pull it out. Naked Agency, Genital Cursing and Biopolitics in Africa by Naminata Diabate. And I believe she is at Cornell right now. She's from Ivory Coast, but she writes about these protests occurring, these gendered protests in Africa where women strip naked to protest the states. And I was surprised to find that this is actually a very common thing in Ogoniland and the Niger Delta region where women would strip naked in front of um, oil pipelines, where if they wanted to continue production or if the police wanted to guard it, they would strip naked. And it was this method of humiliating the state. Like, look at what you are making us do. The elder women in these communities have to strip naked in order to get the attention of the state or to prevent the state from employing violence. And I think that it is a method that has been, on one hand, sensationalized by the media to sort of be like, oh, African women stripping down naked to their natural, like kind of like really we're like to their natural self. I think that there's a lot of there's so much to work with historically and looking at the history of naked protests. And I always tell people like if you're interested in protest method that really gets to spectacle, I think that is a very spectacularized form of protest, but also a modern one too that is still occurring today. You look at naked protest by women. I think looking at the protest of women in Ogoniland and the Niger Delta is one of them. But on the other hand, during Kanserwiwa's time and a little bit after, I think that the protest method that Kanserwiwa was utilizing was very Gandhian in nature. It was very nonviolent, very peaceful. There's a quote during I believe it was the One Naira Fund or one of the boycotts that they had, but there was a quote where they said that we are going to be the first nonviolent protest to kick shell out of our land. So he very much very much utilized nonviolence, but a lot of younger people specifically, I think, who really had to contend with with their future in this land, opted for a more violent mode of protest. And so you see this splitting and moss-up happen, where younger people started to align themselves with more violent tactics. So kidnapping oil company workers, holding them for ransom, the burning of oil fields and stuff like that. And so it's this interesting way that the protests split. And that's really what we talk about today with like violent protests. But I always try to tell people to pay attention to why it happened. They didn't just wake up one morning and were like, I want to carry a gun. It was they saw Cancer, we were being killed by the state. They saw the Ogoni 9 being killed by the state. And such a cruel display of power. In Wole Soyinka's book, Open Sores in Nigeria, it's a very emotional book, but he talks about how it took the hangman multiple times to kill Cancer and Cancer death cry was, what sort of a nation is this? So when you see that and you see what like nonviolent protest, like what the results of it, it can really it really leads people to move other ways. And so with women's protests, we see them stripping down naked. It's a very vulnerable form of protest that is occurring. But then you also see people leaning into picking up guns. And that's really where like you now have this burst of militancy that was usually labeled with the Ija. I feel like the Ija have always been very militant in their protest. But now you see a lot of Ogoni youth sort of leaning into that. I am not aware of any or I don't even think that there's any like formal organization really of violent protest. And maybe that's for a reason that it's not something that they want to publicize. But this splitting from Moss Up and also naked protest, I think I really want to emphasize the naked protest. They're just incredibly fascinated by how organized they are and how intimidating they are. It's also really funny
Mm,
to read the different quips that women have towards police officers and soldiers who don't want to see them naked.
mm-hmm.
I always try to direct people towards there. So if there's any book you can buy, it should be Naked Agency by Naminata Diabate. I really recommend that book a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that illustration you gave because, I mean, it'll be very embarrassing for anybody to see women, taking off their clothes in protest. And it'll definitely drive a lot of reaction. I'm surprised that we don't see so much of this, online, given the proliferation of social media. I'm assuming that if I caught you correctly, that these are things that still happen even today, the women going naked. So it's quite interesting that we don't see so much of it. But it really highlights the alternative methods that people have employed to protest. I think it also does an important job of gendering protest movements and showing the role of women because most times we tend to think about protests, whether it's violent or peaceful, as something that is male dominated. And also we tend to think about it as something that adopts Western forms, or you like writing or open letters and publishing in
Mhm.
papers, holding press conferences and all that stuff, which are fine for drawing attention, but maybe can only appeal to a certain class of people. You must be able to read, first of all, which I don't know what the level of literacy is in certain parts of Ogoniland, but I can imagine that in some of the more rural places, not everybody there has access to newspapers, to
Mhm.
read a press conference, read a letter, or watch a press conference and all that. They may not even be able to follow. But when you see people stripping naked, the message is clear. People
Mhm.
understand what is going on here. That example also highlights the role of women. Um, in protest movements. So really, really powerful illustration there. I also like how you draw a straight line, from, well, maybe not a straight line. I'm talking about my interpretation, but the point I'm trying to make, just ignore my jargon, is that you are saying that some of the violence, or much of the violence we see today in protests against the state, kidnappings and guns and what have you, are a kind of reaction to the way the government treated Sarawiwa's peaceful protest. And I think that is a powerful insight to draw. So within Mosop, there is a split. Some people are not happy with the way, because killing Sarawiwa and the others was not the end of Mosop.
Yeah.
So some other people said, we're not going to take this, and then they resorted to violent protests, and we're still living with all those repercussions even today. Of course, there are other factors as well that have informed the violence of protests in the Niger Delta. But I think that's a very, very powerful insight that you provide there.
Yeah, of course. I really always try to, stress and hammer that violence doesn't occur in a vacuum. It doesn't just happen. I think that when Nigeria gained its independence, there was this promise of a united nationhood. And within this promise, the promise of protecting its citizens. The Ogoni are part of Nigeria. They are in Delta State, a state that is in Nigeria. And so even in the beginning of their protests where they're writing to, the Rivers government, they're writing to Babangida, they're really trying to get the attention of the government, and they're being ignored. And so they're getting more responses from the international world than from their own governments. And that's why they boycotted the election, because it's this rejection of the Nigerian state where they are not doing anything for the Ogoni. They're not helping the Ogoni. And we have the oil cleanup, that occurred, years later, decades later, but it's still at the core. They have seen that trying to gain concessions from the state, trying to appeal to the morals of the state does not work. And so that leads one to pick up arms, because you become very desperate in a way. During my research, I saw that 40% of shells in a 15-year period from 1976 to 1991, 2.1 million barrels of oil were spilled in Ogoniland. And Ogoniland is very small. It's not a big space. And it accounted for 40% of the spills by the Shell and Royal Dutch Company all over the world. So that's 40% of oil spills concentrated on Ogoniland. And these are riverine people. They depend on fishing, they depend on farming, but their land is not suitable for agriculture anymore as a result of the spilling. It's changing, like they're not fishing anymore. It's also changing their material culture. It's forcing people to move out of their land into cities. And so part of my research is also looking at how do you write the history of a culture that is almost disappearing and is disappearing as a result of the violence that they're facing from the state. So little things like language, music, even the clothes that you wear, the way you speak to people, your rituals, those are things that are disappearing as a result of their land being destroyed. And that forces you to become desperate. It forces you to pick up arms, and it forces you to kidnap international workers, knowing that you can face the wrath of the international community and international states like the US and the UK. But that's the point that you've been pushed to. And I think that's why in our discussions of violence, at least in the newspapers, I think that as historians, we use newspapers, but what I'm seeing, it's always framed as, oh, they're a nuisance to the nation. This is irritating. Nigeria needs oil money for the betterment of the state. And it's like, what are you doing to the people that this oil is that their land is coming from? So I really think that's why I like to draw a line between the killing of the Ogoni Nine and the violence that we see today, because they have tangible proof that nonviolence did not work.
Okay, so I was right. You did draw a line. I
Yeah.
wasn't. Okay, that is cool. You raised a number of things, that are very, very important to me. As a historian myself, I'm very, very particular about material culture, even though I come from the aspect of technology, local technologies, how they intersect, with foreign technologies, the kind of things that Africans also create and what have you. But those are very valid points you make. about how the destruction of the land is leading people to abandon it. That is impacting the languages that are spoken as people move to urban centers. They no longer speak their local languages and what have you. Artifacts are getting lost and destroyed. Local music is getting lost. And essentially, we are losing history because of oil exploration under the current conditions in which they are occurring. So that is a very, very powerful point. But you also make, a point, that really segues into the next question I wanted to ask you. And this concerns your understanding of nation building based on the research you've done. So I'm curious to know what kind of connections can be drawn between nation building and protest movements. Are they mutually exclusive, or can protests be considered an element of nation building? For instance, you'd mentioned that Ogoni people are also in Nigeria. So when they are complaining, it's not like if they are necessarily fighting Nigeria, but they are fighting to be a part of Nigeria in the right way, so to speak, something like that. So can you shed some light on the kind of connections that exist between nation building and protest movement, with any examples from Ogoniland?
Yeah, yeah. When I first started researching, I was like the nation, the state, very like poli-sci kind of thing. And I think Nigeria is in Africa's history, in West Africa's history, is very interesting when it comes to the way that they gained independence. It was a negotiated independence. So compared to um, other places like Cape Verde, Mozambique, where they had to fight. They had to go into a war for their independence. Nigeria had a negotiated independence, not taking away from the efforts by nationalist leaders and the protests that occurred. But I think that Nigeria's method of gaining independence was very particular, and that's what makes Nigerian history very particular. Nigeria had the opportunity, I think, during its nation building project to really understand that what colonialism and what slavery and colonialism has done is that it has completely restructured the land. And so, in terms of the different ethnic groups that are present, slavery completely changed the way that they exist, the languages that they speak, their kinship system, their marriage system. We have slavery. You have the role of Christianity. I believe it was John Peel, J.D.Y. Peel, who argued that the reason that the Yoruba became who they are today is a result of Christianity. So like the modern Yoruba identity is very steeped in Christianity. And then you have colonialism, where the British really favored a federal system. They really favored the fact that there were large ethnic groups that they can go through to control the rest of the population. And I always talk about this with my Indian friends, but the British were also really scared to have a repeat of partition with India and Pakistan, and how disastrous that was. And seeing that and wanting to avoid that, that really led to a lot of the policies that they put in place for Nigeria. And that's why they supported Nigeria during the Civil War, because they had seen the results of their actions in India and Pakistan. So Nigeria is a very fascinating place when it comes to nation building. When you add in ethnic minorities, because of this system of Wazobia, so like the three ethnic groups, sort of like
Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo in each of
Yoruba,
the
Igbo,
regions.
yeah, really like dominating those areas. When the language of unity is being used, so this is the spoken word, it's unity, but the actions do not back it. Naturally, a lot of people are going to be upset about this. And I think that no nation keeps its borders without violence. And that's why you see, I focus on the 90s in Nigeria's history, because you really see the state utilize violence to keep those borders and to keep its citizens in check. Same thing that happened in Biafra. Violence was utilized to keep the borders in check. Same thing happened with the protests from ethnic minorities, because they've been protesting for a very long time. But at first, it was against oil companies. It was never against the state. It was against oil companies. But when companies like Shell began to ask the Nigerian government for military backup, gave asking them to use violence to curb the protest, that's when it became a thing of ethnic minorities against the state and against oil companies. And so now the state, for a lot of ethnic minorities, does not exist to represent them. It exists to represent oil companies and foreign corporations. And so there's this split that occurs in like Nigeria's very short history as an independent state, where they had the opportunity to really like really hone in on the fact that Nigeria is an extremely diverse nation. But because they did not do that, and because of the fracturing of its foundations with the Civil War, a lot of ethnic minorities were very much pushed to the side. Even in terms of Sani Abacha's rule, a lot of Nigerians were not concerned with the Ogoni. They were concerned with the fact that they had a military dictator that was oppressing them in like major cities. A lot of the newspapers and radio shows were based in cities, so we only heard the voices of people in those cities. And so when you think of Nigeria as a nation, we're getting the perspective of people who are privileged to put their voices out there, not ethnic minorities in rural places who are seeing millions of dollars come out of their land, but they don't even have hospitals, they don't have proper roads, they don't have schools, they only have churches. And so
That's a good
it's
one.
they only have they don't have anything else. And it
Yeah.
really makes you start questioning what is the purpose of me saying I'm Nigerian, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like what does that mean? What if I'm not getting if the only thing I get from being Nigerian is okay, I'm a Christian, you know? Like or I'm Muslim. Like you only get religion, you don't get anything else that the state is supposed to give you. And so that creates a contested relationship where now Nigeria's nation building project is synonymous with protest because time and time again, they have always picked the side of corporations, but also the elites in Nigeria know that I said this earlier, know that there's power in unity in a unified ethnic group. And so ethnic minorities see this and they're like, okay, we're going to mobilize together as one, but they don't have the power number is not there. And also the history is not there because you think about the people behind the nationalist movement, you know, Nnamdi Azikiwe, what I'm blanking on
Obafemi Awolowo,
Washington Awolowo
Amadu
and
Bello, Tafawa
Ahmadu Bello,
Balewa.
all of them, like like you know the ethnic groups that they're from,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't know the ethnic groups. We don't know the people who belong to minority ethnic groups, especially not even just in southern Nigeria, but in other places. Moses Ochonu writes colonialism by proxy on what the
Mm-hmm.
House is doing in the north. So this is not just a thing that is, you know, for the South. It's not just a phenomenon in the South. It's very much happening all over Nigeria,
Mm-hmm.
and it really sort of created this image of Nigeria's nation as being against the people. Um, I hope that made sense. I started rambling.
No,
I'm
no,
like,
no. You're making a lot of sense, and you raised some other points. So recently, I've been doing a lot of my research in recent times has been based out of newspapers that were published in colonial Nigeria. And as I read them, I begin to find some things that relate to the point you've just made. I see a lot of nationalist leaders who were not Hausa, Igbo, or Yoruba regularly on the front pages of papers. People like Ernest Ikoli, who is popular maybe because I do history, so I know him. But at some point, he was the editor of the Guardian, which is a very popular paper in Nigeria, and he was from Bayelsa State,
mhm,
and he was practicing politics in Lagos, and he was a representative for Lagos in the Federal House of Representatives. There were
mhm,
changes in the constitution from time to time, but he represented Lagos, which today is very difficult to find somebody who is not from a locality ethnically
yeah,
representing that place. You may be appointed by a politician who's trying to show that they love diversity, but to stand up and be represented, it happens even in Lagos. It still happens, but again, you'll find it's maybe happening in a place like, say, Festac, where the majority of the people who live there are Igbos, and so they are voting for an Igbo person to represent them. But here we had Ernest Ikoli representing Lagos. I'll be honest, I don't know the composition of the base, the people who were voting him, but I know they were having elections like in a place like Glover Hall, which is in Lagos mainland, mostly Yorubas. And here's a man from Bayelsa going
mhm,
to the House of Representatives to represent Lagos alongside other people. They were Yorubas like Dr. Lauren Nimbe and what have you. And the same with the rest of the country. There's Eyo Ita, who I believe was from Calabar. All of these guys were on the front pages of papers
mhm,
regularly, but they don't constitute part of that national independence narrative that we hear. We only hear about Obafemi Awolowo, we hear about,
and
Nnamdi Azikiwe, we hear about Sir Ahmadu Bello, and these guys who are from those majority groups, that the British tended to work with when they were trying to negotiate independence with Nigeria. So that makes, a lot of sense. And I think you've shed good light on the relationships between protest movement and nation building, because it is it may appear to some people that nation building is something that is being done by those in government. So they are the ones who are building the nation, and then those who are protesting are working hard to, fight against it. But really,
Yeah.
you really shed a lot of light on it, and I can draw parallels with some of the things I've seen in the papers I was just talking about. So a lot of these nationalist leaders were writing, articles regularly complaining about this. So maybe the colonial government might try to pass a new constitution. And the nationalist leaders are saying, no, yes, we want a new constitution, but not under these conditions you are proposing. In the end, you are making us puppets and stuff like that. They are trying to build a nation, but through protest. So
Through protest, they're carving out a space where they're saying this is not an acceptable way to treat Nigerian citizens. This
exactly.
Signing up for this, and they're very core part in the nation building part. As you said, not the president, not the governor. It's the people.
Mm-hmm. Really, 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 really awesome. I enjoyed that. So I want to ask you, about the human rights angle of this. We've already dwelt on it. It's quite popular, or let me say, common knowledge that the conditions of oil exploration in Ogoniland has been devastating on the environment and material culture, as we mentioned. When we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this damage to the environment contravenes many articles, like Article 3 that guarantees the right to life, liberty, and security of persons, or Article 17 that guarantees property rights and protection, Article 25 that guarantees the well-being of the individual, and a number of others like Article 10, Article 23. There are so many. So, but this feels like a high-level, approach to this question of human rights. They're like global perspectives, Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations. So, are you able to shed some light on this, you think, from local or sociocultural perspectives of the Ogoni people? How, from your research, have you found, how do they feel? I mean, we all know nobody's happy about their experience, but how do they describe it from what you've read? What do they see, about this oil exploration and how it has affected them historically?
Yeah, no, I think at the foundation, human rights for the Ogoni at this time, especially with Mossop and Ken Saro-Wiwa, was very much like, I always say, they just want to be left alone. I think that they're telling the Nigerian government, leave us alone. At first, you had the autonomy option, which was in October 1990, I believe. So they present the Ogoni Bill of Rights. So that includes the right to control and use a fair portion of the oil wealth that's been generated for economic development on Ogoniland, the right to control Ogoni affairs, and also to protect their environment and ecology from further degradation. And so this is kind of like the foundation of what the Ogoni want in terms of like their human rights. They view it as, if the government gives us this, if Babangida looks at this, and if the military governor of River State looks at this and agrees, that is all we want. And so this was in 1990, so 5 years before Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed. It was also presented to the United Nations Subcommittee on Human Rights on the Prevention of Discrimination. And the reason that Ken Saro-Wiwa really used international human rights language is because the Nigerian government kept ignoring these bills and these letters and these press conferences that the Ogoni were hosting. So it was the international community that really began to lend legitimacy to the Ogoni struggle. But still, the conversation of human rights was still being pushed towards the Nigerian government and also Nigerian citizens, because again, as I said earlier, there's this push to be seen as human. At the foundation of it is that we are humans. We don't deserve to go through this. We are citizens. We do not deserve to go through this. So you have that first bill in 1990. After that did not work, in 1992, Mossop started hosting press conferences and writing to Shell, Chevron, and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, demanding compensation for the environmental pollution that they had faced. And this would have been about $6 billion for compensation, but also the accumulated rents of royalties for oil exploration since 1958. So from 1958 to 1992, the Ogonis are asking for $6 billion. And these companies were given 30 days to respond. But instead, they had the Nigerian government respond with violence. And so there are different ways in which the Ogoni sort of like tried to level human rights, which at the foundation of it was always, we want to control our own affairs. We want to control our land, stop the oil exploration, pay us back what you owe us so that our land can heal, and also start an oil cleanup project because we cannot farm, we cannot live. There's constant fire erupting. There was this newspaper article, I wish I could remember where it was from, on a woman who was walking late at night and she dropped her lamp and was engulfed in flames because there was oil spilling around. So this was the reality of them. And so to avoid death by this destruction meant that these oil companies had to leave. But obviously there's profit to be made. So they used violence to respond. But on the local level, human rights in the beginning very much meant to be left alone and for royalties to be paid. So sort of to be paid in order to develop their land.
Thank you very much. I think that makes a lot of sense. I want us to talk a bit about, some of the ironies. I know we spoke about complexities earlier. So just tell me, are there any instances where you've seen in your research that acts of protests were doing more harm than good for the project of nation building, Ogoniland, or the Niger Delta in general? Are there any examples you can give?
I I want to say it's not necessarily to do with Ogoniland, but when Isaac Adakaboro called for the secession of the Niger Delta to kind of like create their own states, I sometimes I try to read that and not be biased. I really am trying, but I sometimes look at that and I'm always like, how would that help the problem of like, so if you have an independent Niger Delta, this was in 1967. If you have an independent Niger Delta, how does that address oil drilling? How does that address environmental degradation? Also, a lot of Ogoni people, they were completely fine with Shell continuing operations on their land. They were protesting for Shell to pay them for this oil exploration. And so there's also a divide because there are Ogoni people, especially farmers, who are saying, we can't survive off this land. This exploration needs to stop immediately. But there are also Ogoni saying that it's already started, so they might as well continue so that we can get rent and royalties. And this is more so leading to the elite response of it. And I feel that confusion and infighting between the groups really stopped them from progressing, but also like calls for secession. My personal opinion, I feel that calls for secession do more harm than good. Historically, we've seen that happen. And so Isaac Adakaboro calling for secession in 1967, I felt it was a result of oil exploration, oil degradation. But I felt that it was a bit self-serving in a way. And I think that's why when MOSOP was created, that was the sort of like after that, first confrontation towards the state and mass mobilization of people that we saw that was fairly successful. So I feel like secession and also the infighting and wanting oil companies to remain really did a disservice to the movement. I'm not one to ever put down the use of violence. I feel like I'm stressing it a lot in the podcast, but I feel that there's a utility to violence, and it would be very ignorant of me in my place of comfort to disavow violence as a protest method because I'm not experiencing what they're experiencing. So I feel like the initial reaction is to say, oh, the militancy today is affecting them, but then it's like you can't really say that because you haven't you're not living through this. This is not your reality. So I always focus on secessionist movements, and also like the infighting is really what caused the strain of this movement. And it is the same thing with all protest movement, where they're still trying to find their footing. Groups of people are never going to agree on one strategy. And so that causes a lot of confrontation between members and a lot of a splitting outside of the Ogoni into the Ijaw, and even groups in the diaspora who might have experienced this, their parents might have experienced this, but they might not agree with the methods at hand.
That is an excellent answer. I know I kind of like put you on the spot with the question. I know, but I just feel like you really did a great job there. And what you say, in some ways, I think brings up the impact of the human factor on protest movements. If we think about even the NSAS movement, there were splits in the movement during and even after the movement about who did what and what have you, particularly when things like interests come into the matter. You know, in the case of the NSAS movement, there were questions about how those who were seen to be at the forefront of the movement may or may not have properly managed the finances, because they got support from, excuse me, all over the world. Nigerians were sending money locally and from abroad and what have you. So that human factor always tends to come in. So maybe let me throw you under the bus again, if that's the right way to put it. Bear with me. But what are your thoughts about who should be leading protest movements? You know, if you think about, you know, in the case of Adakaboro you've just spoken about, or even where Mosop now ended up splitting because they didn't like the way, you know, the government treated the peaceful approach they started with. And even today in the Niger Delta, there are multiple groups, you know, fighting, and all claiming to be militants, you know, fighting against the government. I don't want to mention any group names, but there are so many of them, you know, these boys, those boys, and they are fighting themselves as well as fighting the government. We also know that a number of groups in the Niger Delta are engaged in criminal activity, if you like, in terms of not just the violence of protesting and saying we want, you know, oil to be mined under better conditions, but now even damaging the environment themselves, you know, trying to steal oil from the pipelines and in the process, you know, damaging the environment. Meanwhile, the ordinary people who have no interest or means to engage in this continue to suffer from the actions of those who are leading the protest movements. So when I ask that question, I'm not necessarily asking for your own opinion, but what are some of the ideas that, you know, seem to bubble to the top, you know, when you look at the history of protest movements in Ogoniland, Niger Delta generally, or even Nigeria, about who should be at the forefront of this kind of movement? Any thoughts in that area?
You are putting me on the spot. I'm also not going to mention particular groups or names because I don't want to get in trouble. I'm just a student. I don't want any hate mail. But I think that whenever I think about leaders of movement, I don't think of them as singular people, like just one person rises to the ranks. I think we focus on Ken Saro-Wiwa, and I focus on Ken Saro-Wiwa because of his writings. I think that's really what pushed me to focus on him. But Ken Ken Saro-Wiwa would not have been possible without other Ogoni people who were like interested in ending environmental degradation. That's just a reality. He could not do it on his own. He could not come up with, let's, go to churches and, talk to the people to really rally them on our sides. I think that what makes a good community leader is one, working with other people, but also like a true commitment to the people. I think in present day, in a lot of the militant movements and a lot of secessionist movements that we see that have been revitalized from previous ones, there's a lot of self-serving interest in them. And these people are very removed from the repercussions of violence. So they either don't live in the Niger Delta region and the regions that, they're expressing we need, guns and stuff and violence. They don't live there, so their families don't live there. So they're not coming firsthand with that. But also the people will tell you, the people will tell you the movements that they agree with and the movements that they do not. there are situations with, I bring up like the IRA, for instance. A lot of people might not have agreed with the violent tactics, but a lot of people see the necessity for them. And so it's really when the people see the necessity for it, for this particular movement, for these particular people to lead, is when you know that there's something to be looked at. You know that there's something important going on here. But if your militancy movement is more so bringing, and I'm being so vague, I'm being so vague, but if your militancy movement is more bringing pain to the people, and it's also not working with the community. I think that's one thing MOSOP really does is they work with the community, they work with schools, they work with churches, they work with community organizers to really like have a cohesive idea of what they want. So when they draft the Bill of Rights, it's not just two people in a room saying this is what we want. It's the whole community is sitting down and like sharing their grievances. I think with a lot of modern protest movements, that community aspect is gone, and it's a group of angry individuals who angry rightfully so, but that community aspect is not there. That care for the people who are also being affected by this is not there. And that's why there's such a callous disregard for life and the environment. Because then you ask, like, when you take this oil, where is that money going to? And there's also a lot of infiltration that occurs in movements to really discourage people from wanting to challenge the state. And so a lot of times the people who are funding these might not even themselves be from the Niger Delta. They might be from cities, they might be government officials, they might be, oil workers, just to really sow seeds of distrust amongst the people. And that's why I always think that in looking at a lot of these movements, it's really important to see who is at the forefront of it and what are they saying. Um,
Hmm.
and it's unfortunate that it's such a tragic event that's occurring that a lot of times people don't do that. And so they really fall um into the hands of a lot of people who don't have their best interest at heart. And so we deal with the repercussions of that. But I do feel that previous movements we have seen have had care. I think NSARS to a degree had that, especially with like was it the Feminist Alliance, I believe? Um
Yeah.
I would think that that is an example of that. And they were very much held accountable, but then you also saw them being attacked by the state. They had their
Mm-hmm.
passports seized.
Yes.
But then you saw people rallying around them. They were
Mm-hmm.
I like to think they're transparent with, what they were doing with their funds, but then
Yeah.
they're going to organizations where people were also donating to that weren't
Mm-hmm.
transparent with their funds, that the community in Nigeria, in those cities, did not know about, but they were appealing to the international world. So you have
Mm-hmm.
Nigerians in diaspora donating to them, but Nigerians on the ground are like, I don't know who that is. We don't know those
Mm.
people. So it's always really the people will verify the leaders for us, the community
Mm.
leaders. But I think that it's with newspapers, it's very easy to sensationalize those that the community don't even pay attention to. And so
Yeah.
really paying attention to who's at the forefront and what the people are saying about them is extremely important.
Yeah, that's a very, very useful approach to thinking about it. I agree with you. The people definitely will tell you who they agree with or whose protests tend to whose approach to protests aligns best with their interests, even if there are divisions within the people, So that makes a lot of sense. And I think you are right when you say that a lot of people who are protesting, whether historically or in the present, are harvesting um maybe call it common pain, but only driving personal benefits. And that is quite a thing to observe. But tell me, from your research, what can protest movements tell us about the history of a people? For example, what are some of the things you've learned about Ogoni people and Ogoni culture from studying the protest movements in relation to oil exploration there?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really sat with me in studying the Ogoni is the importance of studying the people, the community, and not just focusing on one person. I will admit, like, I made this mistake when I first started my research and solely focusing on Wiwa. And it's why when I discovered, the naked protest by women in Ogoniland, I was just amazed at this continuing tradition of protesting against the states and the way that they really care about each other. There's a lot of care that has come from this pain that they're experiencing. Even symbolic gestures that they've done. So donating like 1 naira, the 1 naira fund, in order to showcase your allegiance to the struggle that you're participating in. The Ogoni Day Festival and carnivals that they put on where they are reimagining what society would look like if they were not subjugated by the Nigerian state. It's a very communal affair, but it also showcases the strength of imagination and protest, where you cannot accept your reality. You cannot accept that your reality is one that will always be filled with pain. You have to really have a radical imagination of understanding that there's better out there. And because of how arbitrary the concept of nation states and borders are, you also have to imagine that what you are experiencing is also man-made and arbitrary, and that more can occur and that difference can happen. And I think I really saw that spirit researching on the Ogoni and interviewing Ogoni people and also people from the Niger Delta, where there's this radical imagination of something different and something more, that this is not just it. I think it's the same thing. There are people during the time of slavery, people could not imagine that a system of slavery would end. That was their reality, but it took groups of people understanding that this did not exist before and it does not have to exist. Same thing with colonialism. There were Nigerians who could not imagine not being under British colonial rule, but it took groups of people to understand that we are able to govern ourselves and like survive in a nation. And that happens. Same thing with oil protests, where you see this radical imagination time and time again. And I can see why that leads to the tendency to focus on Ken Saro-Wiwa, because in his writings, there's a lot of it's very, I think his writings are incredibly beautiful because it really speaks to the heart of what human beings want, and that is inherently to be free. But you also see that with the Ogoni, even with the naked women's protest, the partial nude protest, it's elder women who are naked, but you see younger people sort of like protecting them, shielding them from this potential shame. And they also take on that burden too of this is what the state has pushed, the elders in our community to do. So it's a shared struggle that they're all inheriting. And I think it's a very beautiful thing to witness and to write about. And so it's kind of seeing the way that like protests are being shaped, it really brings forth the humanity of people to not accept their subjugation by the states, because the state has not been around for that long.
That is a very profound response. And as you know, I agree with you. As you were talking to me, I recalled some of the material literature I've read with respect to nation building. And nation building is really related to imagination. It's about an imagined community. This is what you imagine that it should be like. When people talk about a nation, when somebody says I'm an American, when somebody says the American dream, this is something that you are imagining. And some people who, either through their experience or the way they've articulated it, have been able to help others to imagine, what it can be like to be an American and have the benefits of being a member or a part of that nation, that state. And so in the same way, when you talk about, the imagination that comes with protests, it does make a lot of sense. These people might be saying, in a way, what we are seeing, all this environmental degradation, is not what we imagined would be our, to use popular parlance, is not our portion, as people like to say ahead. So this is not what we imagined. When we're protesting, there is a certain thing that we want. When Nigerian youths were protesting during EndSARS, they were kicking against police brutality because that is not how they imagined the state would treat them. That is not what they imagined the state would do for the police, because they were also asking for better treatment of the police, not just for kicking against brutality of police, but also saying you need to treat the police better. So there was some imagination going on about what could be versus what currently is. So really, really great articulation that you have there. Let's talk a bit more about your approach to history, in terms of like your methodology, sources. We can start with sources. What kind of sources have you relied on so far for your research? You've spoken about some, the materials you've dug into and all that. But just shed a bit more light about that. And what do you wish you had access to, but currently have not been able to get?
I can start with what I wish I had access to. I wish I was in Nigeria. I wish I was getting this degree in Nigeria. It's just unfortunate with the university system and just the way academia is placed in just job process. But I really do wish I was in Nigeria, being able to conduct interviews in real time, and also get to know the community that I'm writing about in detail versus just a few people here and there and family members and friends of families. I wish I was sort of steeped in that. And also to have access to people's family archives. There aren't a lot of archive centers in rural places in Nigeria. So a lot of people keep those photographs, they keep those material, they keep their clothing and all that stuff. And I wish I had access to it, and hopefully they will give me access when I go to Nigeria, hopefully next year. But some of the sources I've used, I always start with literature, which is apparently very unpopular in history. People don't like when I tell them I always start with literature and photography. I think that there's so much to get from looking at the literature of the time and what they were thinking. Diary entries, I think, are extremely important. And I think that's what made it easy to write about the Ogoni was I had the letters and, Ken Saro-Wiwa's writings, and the family has done a really amazing job of keeping his legacy alive. And so it's very easy to access his thoughts. So I use those. If I'm not writing about Nigeria, if I'm researching on, let's say, like Francophone West Africa, I use films. So there's a specific subset of like post-colonial film, Francophone films that I feel really showcase what the people are going through. So I very much start my research through a very like arts, literature lens. And I think it's because I was a film major at first. My first year of undergrad, I was a film major before pivoting to history and anthropology, but I always start there. Then I look at newspapers. So newspapers are really what I use to get how the state is responding to this crisis, what the state wants you to know. So they're smaller newspapers ran by people who are really showcasing the subjugation by the state. And then there are bigger newspapers where the state is telling you what it wants you to know. And so it's always fascinating to sort of compare these articles together and see the responses. And then I also use oral interviews. I think that I'm also shifting into a place where oral interviews are becoming extremely important. And with Zoom and social media, it's made it very easy to talk to people who I otherwise would have had no access to studying in New York. And so that's kind of like my process is I start with the literature, the photography, the film to get like a general idea of, the thoughts of the writer. Then I look into newspapers and then I look into oral histories. And a lot of times it's really fun actually when the oral history completely negates the literature and the newspapers. Like they're like, I had a completely different experience from this. And I'm just like, you kind of destroyed my topic, but you also gave me so much to work with. So that's really the source. And then a lot of secondary materials. One of my favorite academics and writer is Judith Byfield. Um, I really appreciate her work on writing on gender and women's protest and women's labor. Shobana Shankar, she writes on religion in northern Nigeria, but also the fluidity of religion in the area and nation building in conjunction with religion. What other secondary sources do I look at? Toja Oko, she's at Loyola University, but she writes on the Wari people and how they politicize their ethnicity. So I feel those three historians sort of are who I like to mirror my work after them because I think they're doing extremely important work in highlighting stories that have otherwise been covered by the state. And also just by virtue of people not knowing about it, not learning about it, or it just disappearing. But that's really my process. And I also like to start with a family history because in writing about the Niger Delta, my family, I'm from Delta State, I'm Isoko. It really grounds me in talking to my grandfather, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, especially because they still live in Nigeria, about their stories. And it helps me sort of create a foundation and outline on where to go.
Amazing. I think you've covered all the bases. So from the government perspective, from private sector, from the personal perspective. So that tells why you're so grounded, in this topic. It shows you have this wide breadth and depth of the topic and the area, which is really, really cool. Maybe one more question from me, and then if you have any other things you'd like to just, talk about, then we can bring it to a close. Speaking about minorities, you mentioned in the course of the conversation, about the role of certain minorities like women, in terms of the naked protest. Considering that the Ogoni people are already a minority, are there any other minorities whose roles you've seen in the course of researching the history of oil exploration, in terms of what they are doing or even not doing, or how it's affecting them more specifically within this minority, the Ogoni people?
Yeah, of course. The first one that comes to mind is the Ijaw, but I don't even know if I would classify them as a minority group. I think because they sometimes call themselves the fourth largest ethnic group in Nigeria. But I do think that they experience oil degradation and they're at the forefront of, militant protesting. There's the Nembe Nembe people in
Yeah,
Bayelsa.
so yes, you are right. I actually mean like within Ogoni people. So are
Oh,
there any minorities, maybe a minority by religion or minority by any other
okay.
kind of classification?
This is actually really fascinating. I was just having a conversation with another historian about this on the role of um, indigenous religions in Nigeria and Christianity. And it's still ongoing research, but no different ethnic group has sort of come out to protest. But the role of Christianity in places like Ogoniland and even like for Urhobo people, Isoko people, it's also on top of the environmental degradation, it's also part of sort of concealing their traditions and their historical past. So Toja Oko, one of the historians that I really love, I had the opportunity to speak to her. She was discussing how a lot of Urhobo songs are about God and Christianity now, versus before it used to be about, their rituals and their daily life. And so it was through their music we could understand who they were as people.
Mm,
So to answer the question of like if there are any other minorities within like these groups protesting, I would say no, only because of the prevalence of Christianity in these regions and sort of covering um, their past. But also there's always queer protest, but that is not that does not more so have to do with their status as an ethnic minority, but more so as um, subjugated people in Nigeria. Nigeria is very anti-LGBT, so there's protest on that. But in terms of, I think that oil has really narrowed down the specific kinds of protests that they're doing. And so all
hmm
the on that because the real life consequences are what they're living through right now. And so that's just on the identity space. And then there's
hmm
also protesting just against the economic matters of Nigeria, but that doesn't have to do with one's ethnic identity. It has to be with just the
hmm
living.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting transformation that's occurring right now in Nigerian protests, where there's a lot being hidden and a lot disappearing, but so much being brought to the forefront. But the primacy of ethnic identity is still there.
Interesting. Really, really, really well said. In terms of time, temporal focus, how far back does your research go? I know you said you've expanded beyond Sarowiwa, but like, how do you go back to the colonial era, or do you? What's your like real starting point? I know there might be some references to earlier periods, but when does your research period really kick off? Like, what area do you start from,
Um,
and like where does it end? What are the temporal
yeah.
boundaries?
No, that's a good question. So my research is actually being split into two right now. So I look at protest, oil politics. I also look at material cultures, textiles and fabrics, and riverine people. So what does it mean to what are the material cultures of riverine people? I always start with the period, like during slavery. Maybe it's a cop out, I don't know, but I think that even something as simple as the Ogoni migrating from ancient Ghana, the ancient Ghanaian kingdom, into their region and being called, I have it written down, Igoni, which is the Jaw word for stranger. So that also kind of like makes you think about how they're being conceived and like conceptualized by Nigerians as strangers. So I always
Mm-hmm.
start with the slavery period. They were also, as I said earlier, they were very much left untouched by slavery in comparison, to like their neighbors, the Ijaw, who were very much a part of the slave trade. And
Mm.
there's this there wasn't a cohesive identity of like, I am from the Niger Delta, I am part of the Ijaw tribe, I'm part of the Ogoni tribe, as slavery was occurring. And so I always like to start there to sort of showcase that this rigid structure of ethnicity that we have today is as a result of colonialism. And so we're living through the repercussions of colonialism today with like ethnic identity conflict.
Mm.
So I always start with slavery because everyone was speaking different dialects and had,
Yeah.
rituals and tradition. And I think it's always important to hone in that something was different. But also, I believe it was Ajayi or John Pugh who termed slavery the age of chaos.
Okay.
Because so many, like, it was just so much disruption, so much movement. Families were being torn apart. You had formerly enslaved people repatriating from Brazil, coming from Sierra Leone, and making up what we know as Nigerians today. So there's so much identity shifting um,
Mm-hmm.
that I think a lot of people and a lot of Nigerians think about their identity as so fixed. But we also don't really like know our history or how we came to be or how we came to an ethnic group. And so I always like to start there. When I start writing the dissertation, who knows if I will start that far back, but I do know that it's very important for me to really underscore the importance of slavery. And then I usually start with the aftermath of the Civil War because I think that's also another time period where you see this, I don't want to call it like a rupturing, but definitely a change in the way people identify.
Mm.
I think from such a bloody civil war was the result of people's ethnic identity, really changes how you relate to the nation and has had consequences for future protest movements. So even the Ogoni leaders would deny that they wanted to secede from the nation because they know what secession, what saying that word, what that would bring to people, the reaction.
Mm.
So I think that's another important and pivotal moment in Nigerian history. But I really look at, for the protests and oil politics, I look at the 90s. Babangida and Sani Abacha to me are two very important political leaders in shaping the relationship that ethnic minorities have with the state, especially what happens after the Ogoni Nine are executed in 95 when Nigeria is kicked out of the Commonwealth nations as a result. This was during Sani Abacha's time. And so it's really where you see Nigeria receive the consequences or like they're very much rejected by the international community as a result of this suppression when that was not really the case before. Even after the brutalities of the Civil War came out, they were very much embraced still by the international community. And so this is very much the first time that Nigeria had to deal with the repercussions of um, subjugating its citizens. So I always look at that period. But in terms of material culture, I have not really narrowed down a period that I'm looking at just because with archiving, as you know, like getting archival material for rural places is extremely hard. And with environmental degradation and people moving around, it's sort of like everything is everywhere. So I'm hoping that when I go
Mm-hmm.
back to Nigeria, I'm able to sort of hone in on a time period as to, okay, the significance of this color comes into play, or this
Mm-hmm.
ritual is like, removed out of people's minds, or there's a switch in the language that people speak. But yeah, so it's very much all over the place, but more so because I really like to lend importance to different aspects of Nigeria's history.
That makes a lot of sense because it helps to bring that background if you start from a place like slavery or you start from a place like the Civil War. Each of these pivotal events have been instrumental to shaping what came next. So, for example, you might hear some people say Nigeria is a geographical expression, which is a term that a lot of people have used historically, even outside of Nigeria, and some nationalist leaders as well. But just to the point you made about slavery and then colonialism really disrupting, the life of people locally. And some people will say, oh, if not that we're colonized and forced into this kind of union, for example, and given the name Nigeria, we would not be Nigerians. We were independent in one way or the other, doing our own thing within our own groups before that time. So it makes sense, this approach of, starting from this kind of time periods to begin your investigation. And it also helps to clarify some of the notions that people have that may or may not be correct about all of these events and how they have impacted what we call Nigeria today. But I think your research is really, really exciting. Nation building in the 20th century, very valid, especially as we are trying to, define what it means to be a Nigerian. Thank you so much for coming on Nationhood Podcast to share insights from your research. I would definitely like for you to come on the podcast again. And
Well,
yeah, I would like for you to come on the podcast again, maybe when you've had access to some of these sources that you're trying to get, and then you can tell us what's new, what you've learned, what you found, what kind of conclusions you are drawing, and we'll get to educate people more about our history, but also give them things to think about when we're talking about what it means, to be a nation, and enrich this conversation about Nigeria.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. This was a wonderful conversation. I'm really happy that I attended the conference so that we can connect and really talk about this, because I think that it's something that is so important just on the political side, historical side, but also the environment is very important to me. I think that in 10 years, we're really going to have to deal with the environmental degradation more so than we are now across outside of the Niger Delta, but in Nigeria too. And so I think having this conversation is extremely important, and for people to also like have resources to learn and everything. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So friends, that was Jediael Peterson, a historian from Stony Brook University in New York. And I hope you had a great time listening. If you enjoyed the program, please like, share, and comment. I have a few more interviews lined up, so stay tuned to Nationhood Podcast. That's our show for today. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.